Hello everyone and welcome to the new episode of our podcast Společná. Our today's guest is Professor Emeritus György Széll, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Osnabrück, Institute of Social Sciences. He was also at the Institute of Economic Research at Hitotsubashi University of Tokyo. He is also a member of International Sociological Association and is a former president of Research Committee on Participation, Organizational Democracy and Self-Management. He is one of our two international guests at the International Symposium on Democracy in the 21st Century, Crisis or Opportunity. Professor, welcome and thank you so much for coming. May I just ask you, how was your journey to Prague?
It was very smooth, only one traffic jam and no border even visible. So it was the nicest border crossings I had for many years.
Mm-hmm. And how is it to travel to Czech Republic nowadays?
By my own car, because due to corona restrictions, flights are rescheduled and it's not so far from my place, about 600 kilometers. So it was, and my wife accompanied me. So we had together a good time coming here.
Is this your first time in Prague, or have you been here before?
No, I have to confess, together with my wife, I've been here in the mid-70s for the Prague Winter Music Festival. It was fantastic there. We will never forget the atmosphere, although really existing socialism did impede a little bit on the quality of life here. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, I've been an expert to the Soros Open Society Foundation, which had an office here. They still may have it. And so I was invited for meetings to come to Prague, but unfortunately it was very busy meetings, so I hadn't time to enjoy very much of the city. So my wife and myself decided to stay 2 days more after the symposium to have some more interesting also music, whatever culture is offering in this wonderful old city.
How are you looking towards sightseeing Prague without tourists, or at least that many?
Yeah, I know it only with few tourists. I understand that the last couple of years the tourism industry has been very successful. And you have so many, but now due to corona crisis, apparently it was rather few I have met so far. But we all hope that this will be overcome shorter, better. Although I have a contradictory feeling, mass tourism and mass industry is destroying quite a lot of our environment and also quality of life, as you have heard. The citizens of Barcelona, Amsterdam start to complain that their lives, their social life, and the prices for apartments and living have increased due to this kind of tourism. And I think we also, for democratic development, citizen participation for their own urban setting, we have to reconsider the way people move around. And so also for Prague, a sustainable development agenda would be helpful, together with the citizens to develop.
Well, the reason why we have invited you and why we are so glad that you have accepted our invitation and is because you'll be speaking on the relationship between COVID-19 pandemic and democracy. May I just ask you, how did you get engaged in this topic in the first place? I mean, with democracy and participation.
Well, democracy and participation is my research agenda since the 60s when I started studying at the Frankfurt School with Adorno and Habermas and Horkheimer. So I was always interested and did participate in social movements. I was a president of International Student Movement for United Nations, a German branch, and so on. So it's perhaps also on my background, being born in Budapest and the uprisings there in 1956, where my uncle played a leading role. I already lived in Germany then, but I followed very quickly this problem of an authoritarian regime. And so I committed myself in many social movements and direct participation, democratic participation. So it became my main focus. Actually, I did my PhD thesis on education and politics in Algeria, where they started a movement inspired by Yugoslav experience of self-management, and they tried to implement it in Algeria as well. Unfortunately, it failed, as you may know, and I failed as well. At least I got a PhD degree. So I think democratic participation is the absolute challenge for the survival of humanity. I am convinced that ecological problems which we produce ourselves since 200 years, this industrialization can only be overcome when citizens are convinced that in their own long-term interest for themselves, their children, their grandchildren. So democratic participation is for me the key for the solution of the challenges. And then coming back to COVID and the ongoing crisis of our health system. Also, I'm convinced, well, perhaps one first remark that, as I will explain on Saturday, humanity always faced epidemics, pandemic. It's part of our baggage, our problems, since humanity started to exist 200, 400,000 years ago. They always were challenged by hygienic, and viruses exist since 500 million years, so they will never be extinguished. But we have to find a modus vivendi, how to be safe and reduce risk. And that comes back then, as you have seen over the last couple of months, starting with China, but then Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany. We made a lockdown, and citizens were not participating in this discourse. It was a reasonable reaction because we and I don't know how dangerous actually this virus is, which commuted and is still commuting. I may recall I've been in 2003 in Tokyo, and I had a conference in Beijing on social movements. And the conference was cancelled in 2003 because the SARS-1 epidemic started. And as you may recall, there were all over the world just 800 people dead. So not very, although they had a lockdown in Beijing, but they contained it over there. So when I first heard in January about COVID, SARS-2, I thought, well, it will be another kind of SARS as we had in 2003, but between MERS and the MERS virus. But apparently nature is not so easy to control. And we have to invent new ways of overcoming these challenges for society, for governments, for citizen daily life. So my interest was how are democratic societies coping with epidemics, and how rather authoritarian regimes, on the one hand China, but also Russia, or populist leaders like Trump or Bolsonaro or Duterte in the Philippines. And apparently it may make a difference how we rule a country. Although with China, it's a very paradox situation. The epidemic started there, but a very rigorous lockdown. It seems they contained it, and they, with 1.4 billion inhabitants, they only, officially at least, they say they have about some 4,000 dead, which is less than Germany with 9,000. Not to speak of USA, Brazil, or India now. So authoritarian regimes seem to have an advantage in a crisis, but it's a question how long and how in the long run it will work out. I just came via East Germany and Leipzig, and in all former GDR regions, the infection is much less than in the West. And also in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, even Hungary, you have much less infections so far and casualties. So might be that some heritage of authoritarian rule make you more, anxious or more disciplined than people in Italy or Spain who normally like to enjoy life and don't take challenges as serious as it should be. So that's a situation which social scientists, lawyers, political scientists, apparently medical doctors have still to fully understand. So I think we need much more research in the years to come to understand how a society may challenge crisis. And there are a lot of parallels, as we discuss it now in Germany and in Europe, between the climate change, which certainly has much more serious consequences with millions, hundreds of millions of deaths already now, and the COVID, which, already 500,000 casualties. But compared with the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, there were at least 50 million casualties, if not 100 million, on the world population of 2 billion. So it would mean if a virus like the Spanish flu would repeat itself today, it would mean 1 billion people dead, 2 billion people dead, billion, not million. So the challenge is there. But climate change probably is much more serious, and it's strange to see how climate change, even Greta Thunberg and Kids for Fridays for Future, have raised attention over the last year, but still it is dismissed and postponed. We have scenarios 2050 to have an equilibrium, or people like Trump, Bolsonaro are canceling Paris Treaty. So there are parallels, Trump, Bolsonaro and others, negating the climate change, negating coronavirus disease. So I think for research and public debate, it's very interesting to see the parallels, how we treat the climate change issue and the epidemic.
That brings me actually to the beginning of your article, Reflection during the Pandemic, COVID-19 and Democracy, because you are reflecting on the notion that the history has the tendency of repeating itself and asking the question, what can we learn from the history of pandemics? And you have already kind of touched on this topic. I really like a comment of my friend who taught me that history doesn't just repeat itself, it rhymes itself. Do you see this pandemic of COVID-19 in comparison with the others as an opportunity also for democracy, or this just demonstrates that the democracy as we know it is in crisis?
You may have followed here in the Czech Republic as well, that only in Germany so far we have a very strong movement, at least several 10,000, even 100,000 people going to the streets, demonstrating against every kind of lockdown, regulation, wearing masks. Well, part of them are the usual conspiracy theorists who negate whatever is sometime. They're the same people negating climate change, by the way, negating that there's an epidemic at all. And and you have esoteric people and people who believe that the earth is flat and not round, that humanity began their existence 6,000 years ago, as it's written in the Bible. So you have a very strange mix, including fascists, openly fascist people. This kind of counter movement, also in France, there were but only 200-300, whereas in Berlin, some days ago, it were 38,000 people. So, and apparently in US, you have the same kind of demonstrations of Trump followers, that there's no epidemic and it's all fuss and nonsense. So these people, apparently, they question openly the democracy. And it's a very contradictory position as most of these people. On the one hand, they want a strong leader, like Trump, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Putin, whomever. And at the same time, they refuse to accept the ongoing government in Germany. They speak of Merkel dictatorship due to the lockdown. It's a very soft lockdown, as you may know, in comparison to Italy or Spain. It is a challenge. So there are two scenarios we may face. One, as this challenge is now open against democratic structures during the crisis, that people become more and more aware of these dangers and risks, and civil society will be stronger. There are some indicators going into this direction. And the other, as in the period between the two world wars, 1918 to 1939, fascist movements take the opportunity. In some way, the prime minister of my home country, Hungary, Orban, was using COVID crisis to implement dictatorial regulations where he could just rule by order without parliament. So definitely some politicians and the people who support them, I always say Trump or Bolsonaro is not the problem, but the people who vote for them, because there are more or less still democratic elections in these countries. The scenario could be that we end up again in a situation like we had during the two world wars, with fascism spreading all over Europe and leading to the Second World War. So, well, I'm not as pessimistic, but we have to face there are people who really want this with any means. And we have to be very careful and see and even to face them openly, that this is a big risk for society and democracy.
Thank you so much. You were just talking, you actually started with the question that I see as a distrust of science, and then you follow with the populist movement. Mm-hmm. Where do you see the link? Is it a willful ignorance, or is it a hypocrisy that leads these people to support such policies?
Well, this is a fundamental question, perhaps, for all of us. I am a great admirer of a French philosopher, Edgar Morin. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He is now 98 years old, still writing every year a very good book. And he was a resistance fighter of Jewish origin in France against German occupation. And his main work are 6 volumes called The Method of Social Interdisciplinary Science. And due to his studies, he argues that we are not the species Homo sapiens, or even some people say we are Homo sapiens sapiens. No, he says we are Homo sapiens demens. So partly we are crazy, as we can all see in everyday life. But the reason, he says, emotions are neglected in most social sciences. The paradigm which is the mainstream so far is rational choice coming from the economics, Homo economicus, that we always think, we calculate what is good, what's bad, what have an advantage. People mostly are not like that. Recent Nobel Prizes for Economics, Amartya Sen and others, demonstrate that their feelings, even in shopping, which are much more relevant than a calculation, just economic calculation. So the kind of perform to impress others, apparently with sexual relationships, it comes emotion. Very much, and not much rationalization. So in politics as well, as we have seen over the last decades, well, it was always like that, but it becomes clearer that you can, well, Trump for his re-election has no program. And the German AfD, our extreme right-wing party, which was built up in 2015, has now 10% or so adherents, but they started without any program. They were just against migrants, the euro. So you can motivate people, and fascists also, fascism is building on emotion and not on a clear concept of human progress or dialogue, or that we discuss, and as Habermas said, in a violence-free discourse, herrschaftsfreier discourse. So as science is based on this, that we don't kill others, rarely in science. Galileo should be Giordano Bruno. Normally science is there that we exchange arguments, but apparently also in science we have emotions. We have power relationships, dominance culture. So the point I want to make is that also to understand apparently the ongoing crisis of the COVID, we have to accept that people have some strong emotions where they feel not to be respected, or they have fundamental structural problems with democracy. The adherence to democracy before COVID went down in all Western countries over the last 10 years. About only 40% today in Western democracies adhere to democratic principles. Well, majority doesn't care if it's democracy or not, as long as they have a good living. So opportunistic attitudes, as you may recall, it's really existing socialism. Some people survived by opportunism and changed after that, after the regime change. So I think the real problem is how, and that's your strategy in this institute and my strategy, how we can come back to a more open society discourse, as George Soros and Karl Raimund Popper put it, and to bring the people into the dialogue. There's a recent study by the Bertelsmann Stiftung, you may know of it. It is a publisher, biggest publisher in the world, coming from Germany, Gütersloh. It was first a Protestant printing company, and now they own a lot of TV stations. But the former owner, who died about 10 years ago, gave all his fortune and the company to a foundation like Soros. And they do a lot of democracy studies. Perhaps it's worthwhile that you contact them. And the most recent study is, and that links to COVID perhaps, that populism is going down in a moment. So people, due to the crisis, hopefully, become aware of the value of democracy. And they start thinking and perhaps arguing. So there's a chance that history doesn't repeat itself, but that we now overcome the crisis in a better way, even strengthening democracy, the first scenario ahead. So some indicators are there, at least for Europe, that also, for example, this extreme right German party, AfD, has lost about 1/3 of adherents in opinion polls. The same is true for France, Italy. So maybe the first scenario we can win.
Mm-hmm. I will follow on that. One of my favorite books is from Carl Sagan, Demon Haunted World, The Science as a Candle in Dark, which actually promotes the idea of critical thinking and rational dialogue. I'm asking this question based on your answer. And so direct quotation from your article that about the fundamental distrust of science, if it means the need to change habits and values. Here again, cognitive dissonance shows up. We only accept those scientific findings, e.g. new technologies, which seems to fit our own interest. I would like to break it down into questions. The first one is, how can we break this kind of curse of ignoring science when it doesn't fit our interest, and then follow up with what is the role of social media in this discourse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. That is really a fundamental question. Perhaps jumping a little bit, but we can see, for example, the Islamic fundamentalism or Islamic State, Iran. All these terrorists, which are fundamentally anti-democratic terrorists, they use all the modern technology. The Islamic State were perfect in mass media. They had professionals making these kinds of podcasts. So you can be completely crazy, politically speaking, want to destroy your enemy or anybody else who is not believing in your kind of Islam, because they were killing quite a lot of Muslims as well, not only Christians. So you can use it, and that links also the extreme right parties. AfD has more followers on the internet than all other democratic parties together in Germany. So they use the social media, and they have very intelligent people, professionals who support them, not only lawyers. and even some medical doctors, but IT. And you may remember the September 11 attacks that were, Taliban people, IT students who organized it. It was a fantastic coup, technologically speaking, to destroy the World Towers in New York. So these people are able to use modern technology for their targets. And brings me back also, National Socialism in Germany. They were perfect in technology and propaganda. They were the best in the 1920s to control radio. Then they invented TV first before others. So these extreme powers, and you may go back even to Catholic Church, which is perfect in manipulating things. So part of modern science is used for terrible political ends. So apparently we always thought, or some people at least, scientists thought, when you think logically, as you need for IT, then you think logically as well in other spheres of life, on politics. But, well, I have to say, as an atheist, apparently people, religious believers, are also in some way crazy, as Sigmund Freud already explained. They believe in something non-existing and use all the modern science. They are Nobel Prize winners in physics or chemistry or medicine, who are strong believers in a religion. So apparently it can, in your own brain, fit together that you politically are not a Democrat. Many people in fascist Germany, scientists, big scientists, supported National Socialism. So this is a point where we now have to face how to, well, one argument is we should be as good as them and using social media and internet, and not leaving them this kind of brainwashing to extremists. On the other hand, we have a problem with really existing capitalism as well. The big companies use also social media, Facebook, Twitter, to launch their own profits and controlling minds of people for profit making. So this is as crazy, perhaps, as any fundamental ideology. If you're fundamentally capitalist and don't accept social media and not democratic control, Facebook is not democratically controlled, Twitter is not democratically controlled, they have no nation. So you see, these technologies are definitely not value-free. There's a German philosopher, Max Weber, who spoke of value-free, wertfreie Wissenschaft, value-free science. The proposal just doesn't work. And so what is it now for us Democrats as a challenge? How can we use social media in a better way? And definitely, as you mentioned before, what we tried since decades was one of my targets also since internet computer science started. I was researching on the social effects, work organization, how it changed, how democratic participation can control the introduction of IT in companies and public service, how the employees can be trained to understand better and have their influence, because there also you have different options of a democratically controlled technology or authoritarian control technology. And it should start in the kindergarten with little children who already can be trained, because 6-year-olds today have a smartphone and use it. 80% of kids have it. 16, 17 years, 99%. So they are growing up with this kind of technology without understanding the side effects, who controls it, what the data will be, how the data are collected, what they will be done. So Facebook and others have strategies to make you addicted to social media and being not politically interested, but in your little pleasures. And so we, as Democrats, have to face these problems and see how we can have new school curricula, how we have open discussions like the symposium here on Saturday, to make people aware and have counter strategies of a better use of social media in a democratic sense.
I'm trying to formulate my question now, but if I'm collecting from your answer correctly, you're pretty much saying that the freedom, in a sense, has become a commodity, right? It's not a public good anymore. It's in interest of different corporations to raise the profit, which goes against the interest of the majority. Well, not against the interest of the majority, but against the interest of and rights of minorities. You mentioned in your article casino capitalism, which comes also from Soros. Would you like to develop on that point? What is the danger of casino capitalism for democracy, and what is the collateral damage that is coming out of it?
Well, since about 200 years, since modern capitalism became the main force in Western societies first, now in other societies as well, there were challenging people. Trade unions were created to reduce the calamities. Friedrich Engels wrote a famous book about the working class in Britain. So we have a lot of scientists who try to understand the effects, social effects, the side effects, the political effects, imperialism, which accompanied the growth of capitalism as a world power. All this had already been written by Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto. So we are, in history, we are aware that this kind of very successful and powerful economic principle has negative effects for the environment, as already Karl Marx saw 150 years ago. It has side effects for the misery of the people, children, labor, and so on, hygiene, conflicts. So we know that this kind of capitalism, which was already in the 19th century gambling, that means casino, they invest and try and perform, that some lessons were drawn, contradictory lessons. One lesson we call socialism or solidarity principle, trade unions, labor movement, who try to regulate capitalism. In the German constitution, it's written, we don't have a market economy, but we have a social market economy. And in one of the fundamental articles, it's written, ownership has to be socially responsible. And you may have followed also in Czech Republic that about some 20 years ago, we have a scientific and a company movement of corporate, social, and ecological responsibility. So some companies or owners of companies, managers, well, most big companies are shareholder companies, and there was a period where just shareholder value was a main target. And now more and more managers understand sometimes, as we did studies, due to the children, they were asking, Dad, what are you doing with your company? You are destroying my own future with your pesticides and pollution and so on. So especially in Scandinavian countries, so Germany partly and Netherlands, companies and managers started to become more responsible versus society, versus the environment, versus politics, democracy. But on the other side, we have this neoliberalism movement, which became strong with Reaganomics, or Margaret Thatcher, when she was asked, what is society for you, Miss Thatcher? She said, I don't know such a thing as society. I know only the individual and the market. So this is a fundamental definition of maybe casino capitalism. The only interest is to perform better in regard to shareholder value. This brought a lot of crisis for humanity over the last couple of years, and in this neoliberal regime, the control of the market by politics was reduced. Friedman and the Chicago Boys was a school which declared this as a fundamental principle of economic activity. And apparently, as we see these wonderful gadgets of new smartphones, technology, capitalism is doing quite well. Anyway, much better than really existing socialism. Now the question with China is if they manage to have really the most forward technology, overtaking the United States in some parts, creating even environmental friendly technology. But China is a kind of state capitalism. That is, they have the market economy controlled with many state ownerships, but it seems that this is a model with an authoritarian regime. I worked since 20 years very closely with Chinese colleagues and companies. And I once had a colleague from China, from Beijing. He works at the Institute of World Socialism of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And he was sent out with some other colleagues to Germany, Scandinavia, to study social democracy. And I made a bet with him and said, within 5 years, it was 15 years ago, the Communist Party of China will be changed to the Social Democratic Party of China. Like in the West, many socialist parties became social democratic parties. Apparently, I lost the bet, and it becomes more and more authoritarian on the political side. Democracy is oppressed with kind of George Orwell, Big Brother, watching you. Every new technology, cameras. They have a social benefit system invented. So if you behave in conformity with the party principles, you are getting bonuses for traveling and so on. So it's like George Orwell, 1984, put into practice with most modern technology. Big Brother was high tech. And so far, perhaps, and partly answering your question, I wrote an article 10 years ago about Chinese labor relations, changing Chinese labor relations. And at the end, I formulated the future of humanity will be decided in China, for better or worse. And apparently, Europe is now a very small part of the world economy and world society. We have invented many things, but China is the biggest challenge for environment, for democracy, which humanity faces.
To me, it almost sounds like where we started, that it's in the human nature that because we cannot control the nature, we control ourselves. Mm-hmm. And when I'm following up on the idea of unrestricted market or unrestricted state and how they can infringe on our rights, I'm trying to figure out if it's either market or the state's responsibility to optimize the democracy, how we can set the relationship between the market and the state in a way that is virtuous for democracy instead of incentivizing extractive policies. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's interesting, coming back to the COVID crisis. And in some way, apparently, suddenly, even neoliberals in Germany, other places, ask now for a stronger state. Because they saw if we completely let run the crisis, there was a strategy, you remember, that said a herd immunity should be created. So 60-70% of all citizens should become the coronavirus, not the illness, but to be infected. And then the coronavirus cannot spread anymore because 60-70% of people would be immune. So Sweden started this. Britain started, Britain stopped, Sweden continued, but Sweden has 3 times more casualties than Germany per capita. Still they go on letting it go. In 2012, after the first corona epidemic, 2003, 2012, the German government and parliament made a scenario with a leading virological institute, Robert Koch Institute, which is also now following the COVID pandemic. And at that moment, they thought there is a coronavirus, 2012, which will spread if we don't stop it. About 60-70% of the German population will be infected, and there will be 5 million people dead. And the risk of COVID is not only death casualties, but those, about 10% of those infected have severe health problems. Even now we see with not only the lung, the brain is infected, the heart. So 10% of population will have severe health problems, even if they survive. No, most people don't talk about it, but the survivors suffer a lot. And somehow then companies, economists understand this will be very harmful for our own survival as a company. If 10% of sometimes the best trained forces will be infected, that will become more expensive. So they agreed for all the lockdown and a stronger role of state, stronger role of medical science to control the pandemic. Now it starts that they want more deregulation because the price is high, although we have these huge programs, investment programs for companies for individuals as well, workers, employees, to overcome the crisis. So we are at the moment to find a new balance between the state and government and science. Many more governments listen to scientists than before. They still don't listen for climate change, but for pandemics. And companies, as I mentioned before, there are quite a few who accept corporate social and ecological responsibility. So might be we are at the moment against scenario one, the better one, where companies learn and trust more government than they did before. So neoliberalism, casino capitalism, at least at the moment, is less prominent, less accepted, is more questions, especially by some young people.
I think it almost sounds like that's the argument of Homo economicus against the survival of the fittest, which it surprised me quite a bit. Can I just follow up on a bit different question that relates to the viruses and where we started? You actually said that viruses will never be eradicated. We have to adapt ourselves with or without vaccination. So we have to find the modus vivendi with them, but under what conditions? That's how you start. In what sense are the viruses different from the populist movement?
Well, you can say that populist movement is a virus, a social virus.
I mean, half a joke because
I understand that because they infect a society. As when we go back to fascism and the interwar period, it has destroyed societies. Was a terrible. 60 million people died during World War II. As many as the Spanish flu, but also in terrible conditions. So, yes, we can say that populism, it's infectious. People, with help of social media, are spreading. But and it may be also deadly when you see extreme right people killing others, immigrants or whatever, people with a different color of skin. So populism is dangerous. At least there's one difference between a virus in a proper sense. You can't talk to a virus. You can't convince him to stop. You only can control by hygienic measures or being safer. Whereas, as we discussed before, the hope is that even with fundamentalists, a part of opportunistic people who take part in populist movements, you can still reach them, and by argument or by facts. You have the fact finding. Well, newer studies tell us that if you are really a fundamentalist, you still continue to ignore facts. Call them fake news, or you can tell whatever. I remember an interview of a lady taking part in the Pegida demonstrations, the extreme right movement in Dresden. Every Monday they assembled, and then it was against immigrants. It was a popular movement against Islamization of the Occident. And then the journalist asked this lady, but we don't have immigrants in Dresden. 1% of population are immigrants. Well, in my city, Osnabrück, we have 20%, but East Germany still is not a favorite place to go there. And she just answered, I see it differently. So statistics or whatever, they refuse to accept. So there's some barrier where apparently you can't convince them with facts. But for the rest, as we see now that populism goes down these last couple of months during the crisis, it seems that quite a few still can be reached by argument or by facts. So this is, as a scientist, our only hope, that we can reach more and more. And that's again why it's important to start at young age in the kindergarten to make them immune against populism, and starting with democratic participation in school, in kindergarten. We have these youth parliaments, we have children parliaments, very successful tools to implement democratic thinking within young people.
I will build up on that. So we are actually talking about how we can. I'm maybe forcing a little bit my own perspective, that it's democratic thinking and the ability to think critically is closely linked together, right? So we are trying to, as you said, teach the young kids and young adults how to think critically, so they can then value the principles of democracy over those of populism. Do I understand it correctly? Would do you have any examples of projects that help a lot?
Yeah,
I personally think about Karl Popper's debate, but maybe if you have any other examples that help kids to think.
Yeah,
critically.
absolutely. Yeah, as I mentioned before, we have these children parliaments, even within the United Nations. They come together, and they have very clear understanding at the age of 10, 12. What the issues are and for what they are fighting for. Yes, apparently, even with science, we have to have some emotions as well, as we are human beings. And children, apparently, you can't have a complete scientific analysis of as the IPCC International Panel for Climate Change has developed in 5 thick volumes. That's not what we can teach the children right away, but with small examples in the environment. I think the city government, which is the nearest to citizens, has a very strong role in implementing these practices. We have these nature gardens, ecological gardens for children, make them understand how nature works and what is negative, or how negative effects impede on the survival of nature, that water and rain and temperatures play. So children are very comprehensive for this kind of education during school time, after school time. And apparently parents have a great responsibility also in their own behavior to convince their children to have an ecological responsible behavior.
Do you actually think it's the parents who are convincing the children, or is it children who are convincing the parents?
There is a dialectic, as I told you, with the managers, as we studied them. So 30% of German managers are influenced by their kids to change attitude. In a good family life or good community, it is both sides. Children until the age of 4 or 5 just ask questions. And for many parents, it's hard to answer them, and it's fatigue. That's why schools are there. But the curiosity of young people is enormous. And well, there's a critique that schools don't let develop this curiosity enough, but they're trained, skilled, and just capacity, and without, well, you have the alternative schools like Summerhill or Montessori, who leave a lot of room, or in Germany, Steiner Schulen, which let the children more develop. So I think in the long run, the COVID crisis may also help to rethink our model of education and making our school system also more aware and responsible for democratic participation and facing with its climate, hygiene, social behavior.
I completely agree. I'm trying to figure out, but because when the pandemic started, for example, here in the Czech Republic, but I've seen it all around the world, the education started to go online, and they had to transition towards the online education. And from what we could have seen, it had very mixed results. It worked in some schools, it failed in other schools. Do you see the education to be moving towards the online education, or how we can utilize the current technologies to actually foster that kind of curiosity these kids have towards asking questions, but actually not be addicted just to the social media content, but also the physical one?
Well, one part of the training should be a critical use of social media. That make them understand which interests are behind them, that they don't let themselves be manipulated by fashion and tricks, to make them understand not just the technology, but the interests behind. And this is for sure the best way to prevent them to fall into populist, simple attitudes. Coming back to the question I'm asking myself since many decades, studying especially the Yugoslav model of self-management, which was the most developed, democratic participation. It failed, as you know. I just wrote recently an article I mailed forward to you. This kind of culture is very demanding. You have to be competent and to be motivated to dig deeper into issues. So apparent populism and religion, by the way, give simple answers to complex situations. In the 1960s, there was a movement in Italy, parallel in France, and the workers, Fiat and others, asked for a 4-hour day, working day, and 4 hours free for learning and studying and reading the documents, what are important for the working life, but also social life. And there was a group in France, trade unionists, ADRE, who pleaded for a 2-hour day. And there was also French philosopher André Gorz, who followed this pattern, arguing, well, for a democratic society, we need a lot of time, because it's a luxury. The highest level of technology development, we can permit ourselves have the time for dialogue, sitting together, arguing, convincing, studying. Karl Marx wrote something similar to it. Democracy is, in my view, the highest level of political and social development in humanity. because it's the most demanding. I just had a PhD thesis from a Spanish lady. She researched a new model of democratic participation in Mexico, which is now an ISO technical tool 18091. And there you measure democratic participation in citizen movement, cities, city government. And they have 40 criteria. And in Los Cabos, as a city in Mexico, Baja California, where they implemented this tool. Now there are dozens of other cities. So it is a practice which demands training for citizens as well. So they have seminars, they have meetings. Also the city councillors have to understand better what's the issue, not just meeting and the mayor proposes something or administration proposes something. So the issue of democracy and democratic participation is the most demanding form of government. And some people are perhaps not as motivated to spend 2, 3, 4 hours per day, which is necessary in my eyes for a fully functioning democratic society. As you may know from the Economist Studies Unit, from 167 states in the world which they studied, there are only 22 states who are fully democratic. Not the United States, not Japan, Scandinavian countries, Germany, New Zealand, France, most European EU members, but 145 are not democratic, more or less. So you see the way we have to go. And in this sense, Europe is still the island, together with New Zealand, where the democracy is most developed and still challenged from time to time.
I would like to actually have a question in which I would like you to help me with something that with a project that we are running in the institute, and it's building up on the answer to the previous question. We actually have a project which is called participatory budgeting for schools, PBs. Mm-hmm. We've been running it since 2016. It's a fully developed app that helps teachers from any kind of village or small city to run a 4 to 8 weeks program on participatory budgeting within the school. The school allocates a small proportion of money, and it's around 100 euros, between 100 to 200 euros. And the whole school then engages itself in the students are proposing projects, then which are being evaluated, then they vote on them, and in the end they are implementing one of the projects that is supposed to improve the school environment. One of the biggest questions that we are now dealing with, and that's linked to the point you talk about the Mexico and the 40 criteria on measuring democratic participation. We don't actually know how to evaluate and how to measure how such projects on participatory budgeting is helping the kids to build a stronger relation toward democracy and better relation towards their community. Would you have any ideas how we could follow on that?
Yeah, I'm coming back to what I just said. As I mentioned before, I supervised a PhD project on participatory budgeting, which originated more than 20 years ago in the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Very specific conditions. And first, the city of Porto Alegre, city about the size of Prague, 1.5 million inhabitants. And it was an idea of labor activists who wanted to have more democracy in everyday life. And as you know, that was by public meetings, And it worked rather well. It was decision-making about priorities. So the citizen decided if you make a new water cleaning station, build a new school or new pavements in the road. And so they were allowed to make a hierarchy which the city council should implement it. Unfortunately, this experiment only lasted for 10 years. And it was also introduced in the whole state of Rio Grande do Sul, which has some 18 million inhabitants. And it went on for 10 years as well and were then abandoned. The next elections, conservative parties won the elections and abandoned it because apparently conservative parties don't want too much democracy. And why did the citizens themselves didn't follow up? As I said before, it was very demanding, time-consuming. And we also had an experiment like this in Japan, in a city near Tokyo. And the same came up. At the beginning, there was a lot of motivation as the 10 years lasted. The experiment in both Porto Alegre and Rio Grande do Sul. But then people were a little bit tired. There were populist movements coming up, which now elected Bolsonaro as the president, who said that's nonsense, losing time, we have the best solution, a strong state, and you don't need to waste your time in meetings. So a majority of electors changed then their attitude. So my explanation, apparently they were not well enough prepared. Mm-hmm. And then I come back to my kindergarten, because then the citizens had not the understanding. Some were illiterate in Brazil, and they wanted short-term results of their commitment. So we should be, as in any political new strategy tool, we have to prepare it much better than the people in Rio Grande do Sul did it. Democratic participation fails if you don't have the competence and the understanding of issues. That's why also in Yugoslavia, finally, self-management failed because it was too demanding. The people were not well trained and prepared for it. So the social investment, educational investment is a prerogative or a condition for successful democratic participation. It's a long learning process. Capitalism needed 1,000 years to develop to its now new form when it started in Italian cities. I don't know if we have the time. It does us 1,000 years to develop a fully democratic society.
On that note, can I ask you, how do you perceive the link between participation and solidarity? Mm-hmm. And I'm building on your point. We can just find the quote that you're comparing, or like you see it as a development from fraternity, which then builds on the relationship between the liberty and equality. And you are actually pointing out that it is important not to lose sight from the idea that it needs to be balanced. That if complete liberty would actually equal anarchy, the complete equality would lead to restrictions of liberty, and it's therefore the fraternity that can strengthen both the liberties and equality. But in that sense, how it could be made into kind of perpetuum mobile, in a sense that it's self-sustaining. It has these long-term effects, but also doesn't provide short-term dissatisfaction, And in that sense, I would like to lead you towards the question if this complete solidarity is achievable or not.
Yeah, well, this triumvirate of the French Revolution is not by hazard. So the philosophers of Enlightenment who prepared the French Revolution were completely aware of the contradictions which may arise between liberty, equality, and fraternity, or the trade union or the labor movement translated fraternity into solidarity, because fraternity is also gender biased. It's not the sisters who are included. Yeah, it's fine. And it is, as always in politics, a question of balancing different principles or priorities, putting them, and it depends on historic conditions. When the French Revolution succeeded, at least for a couple of years, then the Restoration and Napoleon Bonaparte came and turned everything down. So it was only successful for a short period, the French Revolution. All the principles of human rights still prevail until today. So the balance is difficult. Maybe in a society as ours now, capitalist society with the dominance, as I mentioned before, you have the idea of a social market economy where already the state and citizens come into it to bring down the profit-seeking and even socialize some property which is not well used. So the first difficulty is, for example, taxation, equality, how to bring more equality, a fair tax system for everybody, that where very rich people or companies have more power in society, can influence parliament, can buy parliament via corruption. Most states I mentioned before weren't fully democratic, are very more or less corrupt states. So where wealth and income is the biggest. By the way, China has one of the biggest Gini coefficients. That means a measure of social differences in the world. So you have to find a taxation system which at the same time doesn't impede some motivation that people still work to have some fair income as well. And as we mentioned before, the idea that the weak in society, including the elder people, the people with diseases, children who don't have an income, should be supported in a fair way, that they have a decent life, decent work. So a society has to find a system, and apparently Scandinavian countries are those since about 50 years, 60 years, who have this kind of social economy, have the highest level of quality of life. They have the best democracies. So this is a kind of measurement where these societies so far, not without risks, they also have 20% extreme right people. Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Danish people are, to be said, the most happy people in the world. But 20% are against migrants, are nearly fascist. You have in Finland now a new strong movement. The Netherlands, a very democratic society. We get Wilders, 15% extreme right. In Belgium, with very high quality of income and life, extreme right, people in Flandern, Vlaamse Blok. Even if you have a well-working social and political system as the Scandinavian countries, at some moment there are some people who want to have, or as George Orwell said in The Animal Farm, who want to be more equal than others. You know, that's the ironic term. Who want to have more power, more influence, and starting populist propaganda. Even in the best of all societies we have on earth, you have these people who fight against this solidarity principle, against or misusing liberty in their own ends. So democracy is never a status which is forever well secured, but I prefer to speak of democratization process. It's a process. It's a permanent process, and a new generation or people coming from outside may change the balance within society. Aging society is also maybe a problem, that some older people stick to their own vested interests. So we have a permanent struggle. And if it's democratically practiced, then we have debates, open debates. We have, Habermas made his PhD thesis on the public sphere, the open public sphere, where different ideas are confronted permanently. So this is an ideal, and we try to reach it at best. But as Scandinavia shows us since more than 50 years, it is feasible. The people are rather happy. Economic welfare, solidarity principle works, a fair tax system, social security. So we can do it.
To me, it almost sounds, when we were discussing before the relationship between market and the state and the role of this relationship on the optimization of democracy, now you brought within the discussion about the solidarity the question of the fair taxes. To me, it almost sounds that the state's responsibility is to create such tax system that motivates the companies to invest into the education. Mm-hmm. So is this the argument for increasing, tax reduction for CSR policies, so the companies would be able to deduce the investment they made into public education from their private taxes?
Yeah, we have a lot of tax reduction systems, but going largely, for example, in the agriculture sector, into the wrong direction, or for not preventing pollution. So most societies, even Scandinavian societies, have sometimes a wrong system of incentives for individuals and companies. And this is just the point we have to ask for. We have a debate how far ecological responsibility should be welcomed and honored also by fiscal initiatives. Partly we did it with the petrol price, as you may remember in Germany. We increased it to finance the health sector better. Or in France, unfortunately, the Yellow Vests movement, you may remember 2 years ago, the first motivation was against the price hike of the petrol of a few cents for environmental protection. Although the law was already voted 2 years ago, when it started to be implemented, suddenly there was a movement against environmental responsibility. With queer arguments, also right extremists dominated largely the debate. So the direction of state and government should go into the direction. Unfortunately, while Switzerland is always regarded as a perfect democracy with a basic voting system, referenda, but unfortunately, this is a very privileged country, and the referenda also recently was against migration, was against environmental protection. So also in Switzerland, it's a long way to convince the majority of people to take this responsibility. It costs them. And coming back to the issue of solidarity, and solidarity is a principle which is a long-term project. And well, I remember a couple of years ago, a very famous German sociologist who was also a lawyer, the ministry, Niklas Luhmann, wrote an article when he still was working at the Ministry of Justice, the urgent and the important. And mostly in politics, and we are back to COVID, politicians decide when they see something as urgent and postponed the important things like climate change. And this seems to be a permanent pressure. They're elected for 4 years, politicians in general, or 5 years maybe. And so they have always urgent issues which dominate the important issues. And when we manage to arrive at politics to make citizens, again children, understand the importance of long-term decision-making, then we would be on a good road.
Thank you for that. Because I have this square that I learned about urgent and important not urgent, important, and how to decide on what project I should finish first, and deadlines to task. Can I maybe return a little bit towards to Switzerland and the question of referenda? Because what I really like in your article when you were quoting Miller from 2011, that the strongest challenge for democracy are the so-called populist movements, using democratic rights to undermine democratic principles and values. That these movements rely and propose a lot of referenda, but they support such referenda that are very black and white, the yes and no questions. But in that sense, how we can tackle such complex, is there a case for more complex referenda, or how do you perceive it?
Well, you may remember that in Germany, during the Weimar Republic, referenda played quite a prominent role and actually weakened the parliamentary system, and at the end led to the victory of fascists. That's why the Federal Republic of Germany, after 49, when it was created, had no referenda, we don't have referenda on the federal level. You can have it in the municipal level, if a street goes there or otherwise, or if you participatory budgeting, if you have a swimming pool or a new school, that may make sense. Or we have it on the state level, so Bundesländer, where, for example, environmental issues were just discussed in Bavaria, or protecting bees, as they're important for the agriculture, and what most farmers don't understand, the issue. So that may make sense on the direct level that citizens control their own future. Well, you may say Switzerland is a very small country, 5.5 or 6 million people. That's like a German Bundesland, but has much more effects. So the problem, yes, as I've been following, referenda in France are allowed on the national level, as you may know, and what happens quite often on the national level, well, first, that a referendum is kidnapped by politicians or even opponents to raise another issue which has nothing to do with the question of the referenda. But for Italy, when Matteo Renzi made a referendum on constitutional reform, he failed, as you know, because an extreme right and extreme left came together to what I call a negative coalition. Mm-hmm. That's not constructive, but negative. Out of this experience also in Germany, you can't express in parliament distrust of a government if you don't have a constructive alternative. So not just bring down a government out of a negative coalition perhaps, but the negative coalition is not able to form an own positive answer. So referendum is something in between, and as I mentioned before, a parliamentary system has the advantage, at least in Europe, that we can form coalitions. The Anglo-Saxon system, it's USA never, Britain sometimes possible to form a coalition. It's this party or this with a majority voting system. So compromises are much more difficult. Well, for many years in the Federal Republic of Germany, we only had 3 parties in the parliament, which formed different coalitions. Now we have 6 parties in parliament, federal parliament. Coalitions are even more difficult, but at least you have to find a solution where the majority also and differences. So you may not agree on this point, but on another point. So the advantage of a parliamentary system is that you can negotiate. In a referendum, you cannot. You can just say yes or no. And nothing in between is then possible. And politics in general is mostly in between. And I think so far the referendum on the national level is weakening democracy and democratic dialogue.
I'm trying to actually follow on this, and this is the question of national referenda, and if I stretch it too far, is the question of second round of majority voting when it comes to the election, because that would be could see in U.S. elections, or it's the same issue that we have seen in the last 2 presidential elections here in the Czech Republic. In the second round, we get exactly to the point of a yes or no question. That's one of the reasons why here in the Institute we actually promote the multiple voting system. We call it the D21 Janeček method. And I wanted to actually know your opinion on how we can formulate such debate in the society using questions that requires more answers, and in answering those questions with more than just one vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting approach. But perhaps before, in regard to presidential elections, I'm completely opposed to elect directly a president, because it's a substitute of monarchy. It's a monarch for some time, especially if a president like the American one can rule by ordinance without any vote of the assemblies, and focusing on this person, very emotional and personalized kind of election campaign. So that's why in Germany, after experience of Weimar, where Hindenburg, a reactionary president who helped Hitler to become chancellor, was elected directly. with a lot of power. He could dissolve parliament, he could whatever, nominate the army, strengthen the army. He was a former commander-in-chief of the emperor's army, so not very much linked to democracy. He behaved like a monarch himself. And out of this experience, Germany didn't follow the American model of a strong president, but a weak president who is just symbolic figure to unite the people. Same in Italy. In difference to France, where de Gaulle made, following the American model, a very strong president with all the advantages and disadvantages, that you focus all your political interests on this person and he can dominate the whole discourse. Whereas in a strong parliamentary system, the parliament is the seat of political decision-making and not a single person. So coming back to your question of a voting system, again, in Germany, I think it's not so bad as a model. It served as for South Africa and other, except the presidential strong role. We have two votes, as you know, in the parliamentary elections. One is for the local candidate, and the local candidate is elected. How many candidates are there, even with a relative majority? He can have 30% or the other 29 or so, but he will be elected. And then we have a second vote for lists where the party is elected, not the person. And the Japanese try to copy it now. It's more or less success. And then this is the definition: how many seats any party will have in the parliament. So when they even have more directly elected people, then there will be compensatory seats for the other party who has not so many directly elected as they had the right to have due to the percentage in voting. I think it's a rather balanced system. So you have your own candidate, direct candidate, with whom you can communicate and ask him for his action or non-action in parliament. And then you have a party system which balances and gives a fair share according to the electoral votes, in difference to US or to Anglo-Saxon models. So far, I think Germany managed rather well after the Second World War to be a peaceful country with a peaceful unification, not a peaceful separation as Czechoslovakia. So I think in these two votes is a good system of local and federal representation.
Thank you. I'm actually heading towards the last three questions. The first one is, from my perspective, the current COVID crisis is also going to affect international relations among the countries. One of the most prominent events that is ahead of us are the US presidential elections. Do you think that the COVID crisis or the pandemic is going to affect the procedure and the process of these elections? And do you think it's affecting the elections in favor or against Trump? In favor of Trump or against his interests?
Well, in politics, especially in these kind of casino politics, I would call it, influenced by a lot of money, financial sponsors. Well, the owners of Walmart, the biggest supermarket chain in the world, is directly financing Trump with billions of dollars. So it's not a fair election anyway, what is happening in this system. And as we have seen in many elections, the memory of people is very short. And an event 2 days before the election day may change fundamentally the prognostics. But as you may have heard today, American journalist Woodward published interviews with Trump, where Trump declared quite clearly, end of January, that COVID is the biggest catastrophe in the health sector. But he played it down openly in this personal interview, and they are taped. So this might, today, I listen to the radio, might change even more the feeling of this middle class, which is torn between right and left. That is ultimate. Well, the pronostics so far go for Joe Biden, but that may be even the nail on the coffin for Trump, as he openly contradicted himself in his own saying. But still, we don't know what crazy ideas he will still develop to create a catastrophic situation that the people think COVID is much less important than the war with China and other issues which may, for many Americans, make the feeling anyway that COVID, prognostics is 400,000 casualties in the US until the end of the year. That is a real catastrophe. But the Trump's followers say, okay, people die anyway, and he is a strong man, and I like the way he is speaking and behaving. So then emotions dominate against fact, and this is always possible.
I'm now trying to spin it towards more optimistic outcome of this podcast. So I wanted to ask about Steven Pinker and the better angels of our nature. He made the point that in our history over the last 10,000 years, it has become less violent. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that the future pandemics after the COVID could be better handled than based on the lesson that we are learning nowadays? Or
I'm not sure, but I hope so. And I'm working for this as you do. And there are some chances that we have a more open society and open debate than in the past. And if we manage this kind of education and training, also with especially the young people, we may have a good chance to learn a lesson like our ancestors did sometimes. Otherwise, humanity would not have survived all the epidemics before. And so, yes, I'm a professional optimist. Otherwise, I wouldn't continue to make science and to teach and to speak in symposia and to convince people that we have a good chance to learn from history.
Thank you. I have actually one little bit personal question from the quote that I really enjoyed from your article. You mentioned the late Austrian future researcher Robert Jung was asked at his 75th birthday where he gets his energy to struggle for the improvement of life. And that he answered, I'm 80% pessimist and 20% optimist, but for these 20% I live and fight. Therefore, I would like to ask you, what is the ratio of your pessimism and optimism?
Well, he said this in an interview when he became 75 years ago, nearly 40 years ago. He was a good friend of mine. And in times between, I said it's 15%, I would now say, thanks to Greta Thunberg and other young people who are so active, I climbed up to 25%.
Well, thank you. With that, I think we can actually end this podcast, and I look forward to actually hearing your lecture on Saturday. Thank you so much for coming, and let's hope for the better future together.
It was a pleasure. All the best.